why would some impressive candidates never be able to pass interviews with high-performing companies, and how the danger of going to extremes in behavioral interviews might not be to your advantage. The first example I'd like to share would be outside of job interviews, that of Usain Bolt. You've probably heard of him. He's the fastest man on earth. So an exceptional athlete, and as of recently, he tried to transition into a career of a professional football player. And some would say, hey, you know what, he's the fastest guy on earth, an exceptional athlete, so why wouldn't he be able to be successful in this endeavor? He actually failed at becoming a professional football player simply because the core aptitude required to be a professional football player, at least for that role, wasn't that to be one of the fastest people on earth, right? Now, to job interviews, I'd like to share with you some examples of how different types of roles shoot themselves in the foot by going to extremes. The first example is for a software engineer. So in almost all software engineering interviews, there will be a question around conflict resolution. They want to understand your interpersonal skills. How do you handle conflict inside your team would be the most commonly asked question. And sometimes some software engineers would like to oversell themselves on this topic by presenting examples of how they influenced outcomes even cross-functionally, how they influenced their managers' decisions because they're really good on conflict resolution skills. Well, what actually happens is that if you oversell yourself on your conflict resolution skills for a basic senior software engineering role, that will actually backfire when it comes to your chances to pass that interview, simply because the expectation is not one such that you're able to influence cross-functionally. Right? Now, does this mean that as a senior software engineer you don't have to be good with behavioral interviews? Not at all. But my point is that you must fit into the qualification, into the expectations required for a software engineer, in this case for conflict resolution. So a superior approach would have been here about that software engineer to answer the question of how do you handle conflict inside your team with an example of a conflict with their manager or with their colleague, where they listened to their manager, they presented their data, they communicated their reasoning with the goal to establish trust. And that's it. Okay, so yes, you can take advantage of your interviewing skills by presenting relevant examples with respect to the core competencies to your role as a software engineer in this space, right? What if we take another example here, that of a senior technical PM? I once had a client who booked multiple coaching sessions with me, and what impressed me in those coaching sessions is that they were actually better than myself with these behavioral interviews. Still, yet they preferred to book more coaching sessions because they felt they would get reassured for their job interviews. Little did I know that that senior technical PM was exceptional at behavioral interviewing skills, but was never a technical PM previously. So the example, the moral of this story is that even though your behavioral interviewing skills are amazing, unless you have some great stories to communicate that of a technical PM, your chances are quite limited to pass a job interview, right? Maybe another example here. This would be in a context to understand how to become good with behavioral interviews. To become good with behavioral interviews, you need two things. You need a story bank and a role play. Okay, so I once had a candidate for a principal PM role, and he was an exceptionally talented person. He had the technical requirements to do the job, and he also happened to write really well. He was not a professional writer, but was someone who enjoyed writing. Who enjoyed writing their story bank to the extent that story bank got to, 60 pages documents. And I had to review all that stuff. Now, if you remember, I said becoming good with behavioral interviews, it means two things: your story bank and your role play, your ability to communicate those stories. And what happens is, in the many coaching sessions we did, he was always extremely skeptical of communicating the idea he wanted to transmit. He was always on the idea that, hey, Dan, you know what, but you can read my stories. They are amazing. Why do I have to tell you all these stories? And in fact, the little we role played, I noticed, there was a challenge for him with these things. But he over-focused on his strength of writing in the detriment of communicating the idea he wanted to transmit. So had he focused on communicating the idea he wanted to transmit more than writing it, because he already had the content, they were exceptionally talented, they were well qualified for the role, that would have been a superior approach here. And maybe one more example that happened with another client of mine was someone interested in a director of procurement role. It was with a well-known company. And what happens is this candidate was a professional speaker. I mean, maybe not, they weren't doing it professionally, but they were a speaker, someone who communicates extremely well. And again, his focus throughout the interviewing process was communicating and, bluffing his way through, so to speak, by communicating as convincingly as possible in order to make his point in these job interviews. And to his credit, it seemed to be working quite well, at least in the screening rounds. He always passed all those screening rounds. But what happened is that his ability to communicate well, his impressive communication skills were not interpreted as he would have expected so during the final interview rounds. And throughout my conversations, I felt like, he was trying to leverage his communication skills in the detriment of taking feedback, constructive feedback, I would hope. And, the core competency for a director of procurement wouldn't necessarily be to be a speaker, but rather to be a more persuasive and even a technical, people with some technical expertise. So again, his strengths, his communication abilities did not play to his advantage in this job interview because he failed to focus on what actually mattered for the job description that he was applying for, being persuasive and all that stuff. So basically the main takeaway from here would be that many candidates have a strength, and it's generally accepted advice that in a job interview you should always sell yourself on your strength. However, I would warn you that it's more about finding the right balance between the core competencies for your role and your strength, and trying to use your strength to sell yourself as good as possible on the core competencies for the role, and not vice versa, to pitch your strength, such as your communication skills, to complement or to supplement, I should say, the core competencies for the role. So I hope you found this useful, and thank you very much for watching.